Hi, everybody. I want to welcome you once again to the that we hold on the second and the fourth Tuesday of every month at 3 o'clock. The link that you took to get to the meeting today is the same link that you can use for all of our meetings. So keep that in a very important place for yourself so that you can access it at any time. I also want to let you know that we do record these meetings and that we put them on YouTube. And right now, I think we're like at 73 videos up there. So I want to encourage everybody, go check those out because they really are a fantastic resource as you're trying to navigate this long-term care path. So take a look at our YouTube page, which is LTC Ombudsman on YouTube. So nice and easy to access. So please do. Actually, it's ILLTC Ombudsman. So please do access that. And I know we've got Stephen here, the man behind the scenes, putting all those links into the chat. So I want to encourage everybody, take a look at that chat so that you can access that stuff. So you can take a look for future reference. These meetings we put them together so that we can make sure that people feel empowered with information. It's really important that everybody understands that any rights that you had that while you lived in in the community at large, you have the same rights as you're entering into a long-term care community. And one of those really important rights that we have in our country is the right to vote. And this is a very important topic with our pending election that we have coming up in November. And we have talked about this before, but we felt like this is an opportunity for everybody to really understand what it is that the long-term care community should be doing, why it's important to vote, and try to motivate and inspire people to make sure that they are doing that. There's a lot of important elections going on at the state level as well as the federal level. So we want to make sure that everybody adheres to their right and votes. So what we've done today is I'm going to actually introduce, we're sitting here today in the office together, Karen Kloppe and I, we are sitting here today to have this conversation, and she's going to lead the presentation. And of course, I'll be here asking those questions. And if anybody else has any questions, please do feel free, put them in the chat. Or if you want to raise your hand or just unmute your mic, we'll be paying attention to that so that you can go ahead and you can ask your question if you don't have access to a keyboard, you don't feel like typing it, or you're on the phone. Okay, so with that, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pass this off to Karen. I will actually put the presentation up on the screen so that we can all follow along. Okay, so here we go. There's Karen for us.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Lee mentioned, I am a colleague here at the Department on Aging. I actually work for a different division, the Division of Home and Community Services, where I serve as the state's legal assistance developer. So my role, which is required under the Federal Older Americans Act, is to provide technical assistance and support to our protection and advocacy programs, which includes the ombudsman programs, as well as the legal services that pass through funding to local legal providers through each area agency on aging. Given the timing, we're talking about voting rights, and Election Day is literally right around the corner on November 5th. And we want to make sure that your right to vote is honored as a person living in long-term care. But as an attorney, I can't help but give a legal disclaimer, and everybody always laughs at me. I am not the definitive source for election information. That would be your local election authorities. And I put the link there for people to find their authorities. And because this is an issue about voting rights, you should know that the information we think is accurate for today, but it is subject to change based on new laws, litigation, and other technological developments. And in Illinois, as in many places across the country, there are periodic changes to voting rights. Sometimes they are to expand voting rights, and sometimes it appears that they are to contract voting rights. But the only thing that you can say is that change is always going to be a part of our life. So we're going to talk and give a quick refresher on voting rights, what assistance you can get from your long-term care facility, how to check on your voter registration status and find your current polling place, as well as the assistance that you can request from election authorities. So I thought first it would just be like a flashback to high school civics, and it's about the topic of voters themselves. In order to vote, you have to be a registered voter. Almost everybody has the potential to be a registered voter, but there are some exceptions. And people who can't vote include non-citizens, people who are in a penal institution because they've been convicted of a crime. And although personally I have never seen it in Illinois, people under guardianship, if voting has been suspended by the judge or the court. We don't have a flat prohibition on the guardianship issue, but it is a theoretical possibility, but it depends on the particular guardianship order. And voters have rights, and in part they come from the Constitution, and in part they come from the laws relating to nursing homes and the care provided therein. So under the exercise of rights, you as a resident of a long-term care facility have the right to exercise the rights as a citizen or resident of the United States. And voting is a key right of all adults in the United States. It's what makes our democracy go around. And I put this out because for every election, the election authorities come up with different deadlines. And you notice that for our November 2024 election cycle, some of those deadlines started way back in August. And I have put a little red triangle on the left to show that given today's date, some of the information has just recently closed. Online voter registration closed on October 20th. Dates can vary, but as of October 21st, that was the first day for early voting for the election. And early voting is where you actually go in person to authorized election site and cast your ballot. But there is still chance to request a mail-in ballot. That deadline is coming up on October 31st. And then for people that are trying to vote early, you have to get that done by November 4th. If you're not able to take advantage of early voting opportunities, then your day is going to be Election Day, November 5th. And that is the day that is going to be the cutoff for registration and postmarking mail-in ballots.
Karen, just to intersect for a minute, are you going to talk about mail-in ballots?
Yes,
Okay,
in another
great.
couple slides.
Okay,
But
thank you.
first I wanted to show some of the information that you can get through the Illinois State Board of Elections. That is the head of the election authorities. They have other officials throughout each of our 102 counties that do the day-to-day work. And it is a lot of work because roughly 244 million Americans are going to be eligible to vote in the United States this year. Registration is open year-round, except they've got certain cutoff periods prior to an election and during the period after the election. So we're going to go on to the next slide. And when you go to the State Board of Elections website, this is what the screenshot looks like. And a key part of the information is there on the left side where you see the red and the smaller white arrows, and that's relating to voter services. So the State Board of Elections has a wide variety of functions, but basically they determine how the election process is going to be set up in the state. They handle the supervision, inspection, and review of the election and registration processes. They prepare training manuals for the officials and volunteers who help make the day-to-day processes of the election run smoothly. They determine the validity of nominating positions. They pass along general information about your voting rights. They investigate complaints relating to the voting processes during election cycles. And they approve the use of the voting machines and other assistive devices for individuals who have disabilities to have greater access to voting. So that they have a lot of work going on. So under voter services, you can find an online voter registration tool, your polling place locator. You can find out who your elected officials are if you need to know that. And then there's an Illinois voting guide at the very bottom. So this is actually the address from the preceding slide for the voter registration lookup tool. I went and checked this myself recently, and this is what that screen looks like. You can see you don't need to have a lot of complicated information to get it submitted, but you do need to know your key identity information. And again, there's this warning saying that, the online voter registration is going to close down as of the 20th. You can still do things in person, but the convenience of doing things online is now going to be temporarily frozen out. The next key thing I wanted you to be aware of from the State Board of Elections website is the polling place lookup tool. And before heading out, if you're going to vote in person on November 5th, I strongly encourage you to look up your polling place. I wanted to test this in advance of this presentation, so I looked up my polling place, and I was caught off guard because my polling place has changed for this year. And it's something that I hadn't registered because during COVID, I took advantage of early voting options, so I didn't have to make the appearance in person. And I would have been very frustrated had I gone to vote, because typically I wait to the last minute when I get off work and run by, because my polling place had historically been just a block or two away from where I live. So I always swung by at the end. So I'm glad I took the time to look it up so I will know where to show up. And so you can see, this is what information pops up when you go to that particular tool on the State Board of Elections website. The last thing I wanted to point out is if your name or address has changed because you're new to a long-term care facility, you should update your voter registration, meaning your address, assuming you still want to participate in elections. So you can contact your local election officials and see if there's a way to do that. Because usually you can do that online, but they may be able to do things over the phone. I can't guarantee that, but it's always worth taking the easy step first, particularly since I know some older adults have some mobility and transportation challenges as in their lives. Also, your local elected officials typically have office staff who can provide assistance on all of this process. They're in the business, so to speak. And now I wanted to talk just briefly about what you could expect in terms of assistance by long-term care facilities. So Lee and I briefly discussed this recently. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, which set a lot of the standards regarding care in long-term care facilities that have individuals living there for whom expenses are paid under those two federal programs, periodically sends out a memorandum to what they call the state survey agency directors. And at the very bottom, you see the legal authority. And this is a recent memo that was sent out, again, reminding facilities of their responsibilities so that its residents can exercise their right to vote. So on the slide, I've put key examples of how you can expect to get assistance from your facility. It starts a little bit earlier about finding out, what you need to know about voting if you're new to the facility. Maybe you have a disability. Maybe you're like have vision difficulties, a language barrier, so that you can have help filling out and mailing any required applications. Um, they should be helping you qualify for available alternatives if you don't want to try to go to vote in person. That's that coded language that I refer to as early voting options. They're supposed to be helping you get to the polls. And that includes going into the polling place to assist with reading and marking ballots and ensuring that ballots get submitted so your vote can count. This is really important because, as we all know, no one person can know everything all the time, but you have federal rights based on the Constitution, based on federal voting laws, based on federal accessibility laws, and based on state laws regarding voting rights. So your long-term care facility has responsibilities to you, but I will be the first to say, please avoid challenging situations by waiting to the last minute if you want to get that assistance. It is always easier to check in advance, so that the facility can maximize the care that is being provided by staff.
So Karen, I have a question for you regarding that. If the home, so far you haven't heard them talk about anything in regards to the elections, what would you suggest that they do?
I would reach out first to the activities person.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know whether they're called a director or just an individual staff member.
Yeah, the terminology can change depending
Okay.
on building to building.
After that, I would work my way up. Everybody that's in a facility should have, do they call them plans of
Plan
care?
of care,
A plan of
yes.
care. So if voting is really important to you, that's something that you would want to make sure in the future gets into your plan of care. Alternatively, you can reach out to various advocacy organizations and they may be able to provide some assistance. And at the very end of the presentation, I will give you some resources so that you can see some of the advocacy organization. And then if you are blessed and you have family members living in the area, don't hesitate to reach out to your loved ones and say that you're interested in doing this. It may be a nice mini trip where you can maybe catch a meal and have a visit or get a snack. And I know from personal experience, I always wanted to do things for my mom as she got older. And if this was something she would be interested in, I would have been all over it because I wanted to come up with ideas that met her interest, but sometimes I wasn't exactly sure. So you have to be open to having those conversations.
That's, and what, if I'm not registered, if I go and do that on the site and I see, that, whoops, I'm not registered. I thought I was, and now I'm not. It's too late to do it online.
Right.
Do you know where would I go to get registered?
You would contact your local election authority. And so you go to that state board of elections website to get the phone number and find the contact information. Because typically at this point, they would want you to come in person, but it's possible that they could make an accommodation and still get you something in the mail. But again, the time is getting very short. I don't know that anybody can make any type of changes by phone, but as I indicated, it is worth making the ask. But again, the longer you take to ask your questions, the more challenging it will be to get the assistance that you might like to receive.
And one more question around that. Is there a last date for registering to vote?
I believe the last date to register to vote is the day before the election.
Okay.
But I am not 100% sure of that because I've read different information. And to make it a little bit more complicated, Illinois talks about early voting options, but then what are the early voting options? There's a thing called an absentee ballot. There's the concept called early voting. There's vote by mail, and new to Illinois, there's a permanent vote by mail list. I have tried on this slide to write down some of the key deadlines associated with each of these concepts. So an absentee ballot is something that you are typically going to do simply by mail. But they have to be postmarked after you make your selections by November 5th and received within 2 weeks of November 5th to be counted. You can request an absentee ballot in person. And the restriction is it has to be 1 day before the election. They can be done by mail, and that's 5 days before the election. And then for people that aren't necessarily in your situation, they deal with people who are overseas for work or military service. Then the early voting is when you actually go in person to a particular polling place, and you have to get that done by November 4th. The vote by mail application deadline is October 31st. And then if you have mobility or transportation challenges, you may want to consider requesting a permanent vote by mail list. And different areas may have different cycles that they can't control because they also depend on the U.S. Postal Service and your local mail delivery. But I personally received a postcard about this within the last couple weeks. And I say within the last couple weeks because in my home life, I have 4 beautiful little cats. And my mail comes through a slot in the door. And one of the cats, that's his particular territory. And sometimes he bats things around. And then when I'm cleaning a week later, and I get my broom out to go underneath this piece of furniture, lo and behold, I've got some mail there that I didn't realize that I had received. So when you have any type of a mail ballot, the absentee ballot or the vote by mail, it is imperative that you read the instructions to make sure that you comply with all the requirements. So typically they are returned through the mail, but some locations have a secure drop box so you don't actually have to park and navigate into the building, or they can be returned in person. Did you have a question, Lee?
Yeah, it sounds like the vote by mail is what many long-term care communities do, from what I can recall from the days that I've worked in long-term care. So if you do live in long-term care, your loved one lives in long-term care, you work in long-term care, look at that date. The deadline is October 31st, which is next week. So if that is you have not voted yet, you don't see the ability to be able to go out and vote. You may want to make sure that you get that vote by mail in. So I just want to make sure that everybody, just to emphasize
Yes.
that.
And it is a challenge because the election authorities are working in their purview. But I know in the community that I live in, there have been some efficiency measures taken by the United States Postal Service. So that results in a change in the delivery cycle, with mail not coming directly to this area, but going to a regional hub before it gets to this area. So there could be some unexpected delays where you would just miss out.
So you might want to ask the long-term care community that if you are voting by mail, that to ensure that your vote gets counted, that they bring it to the post office and they get that verified that they're getting postmarked by the 31st, because that's
Yes.
postmarked. So that might be something that you want to do, not to wait for them to bring it in on the 31st, that maybe they bring it in on the 30th, so that you can make sure that your vote does get counted. I do know many times that people that live in long-term care, their right to vote does not happen, because they are there, they might be there at a long-term care, at a nursing home for just short-term stay. So they didn't do the absentee ballot because that wasn't their address. And they kind of just throw in the towel thinking that they cannot do any other way to vote. So you might want to really make sure that you're really paying attention to this. Even forward this video once we get it posted to your activity director, to make sure that this is something that does happen for you. We want to make sure that everybody gets their right adhered to.
So I wanted to talk briefly about voter rights. Again, this is a flashback to your days of high school civics, but you have a right to vote privately and independently, and you should be able to vote in an accessible polling place if you are a voter with a disability, or to request a reasonable accommodation to vote. So when you go in person, you should not need to present an ID to vote, but there are limited exceptions. And those exceptions involve when there is some confusion as to how you intended to vote. Perhaps you had requested a mail-in ballot, but ended up deciding to go in person. Those exceptions are set in the law. You have a right, in addition to the accessibility options, to request help with voting. And again, there are limited restrictions. So the people who help you to vote, for many of you, this will not come into play, but they can't be your employer, the representatives of a labor union, or in some cases, a candidate, unless that candidate on the ballot is your spouse, parent, child, brother, or sister. You can get help by bringing a friend or a relative or someone else you choose. You can also ask the workers at the poll for assistance. And when you are using that assistant, that person does not have the right to try and influence your decisions as to who you vote for, or possibly which ballot measures you are interested in approving. Usually, if there is assistance from a poll worker, you'll find two people helping you, so that there is a representative from each of the major political parties. And also, if you need to have what I call like a cheat sheet, or some entities provided this My Plan to Vote. And when we produce the resources that accompany this, I found this literally like just a couple minutes before I came to join Lee. So I'll make sure that we have the link to that available.
I'll take it. I'll take it right now. We'll make sure that we get that put into the chat.
Because I thought that was pretty handy, particularly for someone who may be having somebody else help with the transportation. You can get all the kinks worked out. Now, if you would choose to bring that information in, you need to realize that it's not appropriate to bring in any type of campaign literature. And if there is a question as to your eligibility to vote, it's very important for you to remember that you are entitled to a provisional ballot, so that you preserve your right, and the voter eligibility issues will be resolved after the fact. Again, you have a right to assistance by election authorities. So you can request language access, ask about available voting aids, help reading the ballots, or help using the voting machine. The poll workers who you ask for help, again, they don't get to question you as to why you are asking for assistance, for you to prove that you have a disability. They can't stop you from bringing the person of your choice to provide help to you as a support person. They can't stop you from voting. So don't hesitate to assert your rights. And some of the rights that you have regarding accessibility are you could bring a service animal in. You should be able to expect that the facility itself is accessible, meaning that they have ramps, handrails, elevators, that they have accessible parking places, that the material that you need to look at is in large print, that the rooms and pathways are accessible for a person who is in a wheelchair, that they have other devices for individuals who have visual impairments. So on election day, the polls open really early at 6 a.m. and the polls close at 7 p.m. However, this is your right. If you are still in line when the polls are scheduled to close, you can stay late and cast your ballot. Now, they shouldn't, again, be asking you for your ID, but you will be expected to verify your signature on the voter cards. And again, if there's that question about you had requested a vote by mail, but now show up and want to vote in person, they may ask for some type of ID. And the ID that you use has to show your name and address. And if for some reason there is an issue, exercise your right to cast a ballot by seeking a provisional ballot. And I know that's kind of awkward language, but that is the key term, is provisional ballot. Now on the ballot, I have put at the very bottom, there's a sample ballot lookup tool. I didn't find this on the State Board of Elections website. I found it on a different website called ballotpedia.org, and it's geared toward each state. But you should expect to see candidates for federal, state, and possibly local elected offices. How the ballots in the electoral process works really depends on whether you're on an even year cycle, which we are in 2024, or an odd numbered year cycle. And so you will be voting for this year, and I'm sure everybody knows this, but just in case, it's the president and the vice president, US House of Representatives, I believe the state Senate and state House of Representatives, and various judges at different levels, from the Supreme Court to the appellate court to your local circuit courts, could be on ballots. And you may not have all of the same offices in every county, because each county has different political districts that have different types of elected representatives. For example, in Cook County, you have a county board of commissioners. I know that there is a lot of interest over leadership for Chicago Public Schools, and they have a taxing district called the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District of Greater Chicago. So sometimes the question, you have to read it, but since I'm an attorney, for circuit court judges, they sometimes are not asking you to elect them, they are asking you to retain them in office. That usually means that they previously became a judge and now they are up for a new term of office. Some areas you may have the state's attorney's office. So there are all different types of positions that you have a chance to look for. And the other thing that is going to be on the ballot this year are 3 statewide ballot measures, which are called advisory questions. And I'm going to have the next couple slides so that you can preview those. One of the issues is whether or not there should be an election worker protection and candidate accountability referendum, so that any person appearing on the ballot for local, federal, state office is subject to civil penalties if that candidate interferes or attempts to interfere with an election worker's official duties. You'll have a chance to vote yes or no. A second one is about property tax relief and fairness. And the question that you're going to be asked about is, should the Illinois Constitution be amended to create a 3% tax on income greater than $1 million for the purpose of dedicating funds raised to property tax relief? And the third question is related to the Assisted Reproductive Health Referendum Act. And that question is going to be, should all medically appropriate assisted reproductive treatments, including but not limited to in vitro fertilization, be covered by a health insurance plan in Illinois that provides coverage for pregnancy benefits without limitation on the number of treatments? Some of these issues may be important to you and some may not, but it is your right to provide elected officials with your feedback on these policy questions. So again, when you are going to vote in person on November 5th, consider whether your polling place is going to be accessible to you if you have limited mobility or some other health issue where things are time sensitive to you. So you want to check in advance with your local election authority, because if the polling place is not accessible, you may have the option of what is called curbside voting. And what curbside voting does is the election judges, again, one from each political party, bring the ballot out to you, but you've got to be within 15 feet of the polling place. You then mark the ballot and give it back to the election judges, who take it back inside so that it can be put into the ballot box. Now, I am saying that this is an option. I'm not saying that it is a guarantee. So again, think about how you work and what your needs are. That will help you determine, not only for this election, but also future elections, what type of voting option is going to suit your needs the best.
So I'm just curious if this would be something where, if a long-term care community was to have a bus and there's many residents and they wanted, there was a lot of residents who wanted to vote in person, if this might be an option where the election judges could bring out to multiple people at a time. Just curiosity.
I would be surprised because typically this is to address an accommodation regarding accessibility issues. And not everybody on the bus would meet that, because we can't expect the judges to come out for every single person. But if for some reason there isn't nearby accessible parking, if the elevator isn't working, if the ramp is under construction, this may be the solution to meet with a reasonable accommodation.
I could see it even being for a person who may not be able to get out of the car on their own. They were able to, a neighbor was able to help them into their car, couldn't go with them, but once they got
Right.
to their site, they can't get out of the car independently. So that might be something that could be useful for that as well.
And I have helped two people in my life who needed to use a wheelchair. And this was pre the different mobility scooters and the rollators. And my gosh, you have to be a pretty strong person to get the wheelchair assembled and get it lifted in and out of the trunk. And if you have to do that a couple times in one day, you've used your bicep.
Yeah.
Now, I put this together. This is from the ACLU Illinois, and this is what is called a foldable voting rights card. So this is something that you could print out and put into your wallet. And it is just a brief summary of the various rights that we have talked about previously in your discussion that I thought you might find useful to have. And as we're getting toward the end of the presentation, I wanted people not to be surprised. You'll hear about, poll predictions and, exit polls, but don't expect the results to be finalized on election day. We know from recent presidential elections the infamous Chad experiences that brought that new terminology into our dictionaries, that state certification deadlines can range from 2 to 29 days post-election. But that's no reason not to have a fun election party. My friends and I, because we all worked in the legal system, used to get together quite a bit on election days and make like a big pot of chili or spaghetti and flip back and forth between the channels and kibitz with each other about what we thought might happen. So it can be a very fun time for you. And last but not least, I indicated previously, we had that tool that will be listed with the resources for this presentation when it goes onto YouTube. And, but you can plan ahead. So to put together, particularly if this is your first time voting, while you're living in a long-term care facility, or whether you've had some health changes since you last got out to vote independently, take the moment to preview your ballot. This presentation gave you a tool to do that. You can research candidates and the advisory questions to help you form your opinion. You can check on your voter registration status, because if you show up in person and there's a problem with your registration, you're going to not be able to vote. So you would need to request that provisional ballot. If you have the mobility issues, transportation challenges, other things going on in your life, consider your early voting options. Again, those are very time sensitive, given that we are already in late October. Before you head out to vote in person, make sure you confirm your polling place, because there could have been changes. Also, if you have needs, it's to your benefit to ask in advance about any personal accessibility needs, to arrange transportation and find out about parking options. And this is just a very common sense, but because I have served as a caregiver, you want to time your visit so you avoid busy traffic or traffic delays, crowds, conflicts with meals, medication, or other scheduled appointments. And I say that as a practical hint because in my personal caregiving journey, I was with someone who is diabetic, and if things went on longer than anticipated, we might have to make arrangements to check blood sugar, which is something some people are not comfortable doing in a crowd. They want some privacy, which means you then have to possibly get out of line and find like that private place, but then you're on your feet a little bit longer and you have to get back into line. So these are just some very practical hints. They're not anything that you are required to do. They're just things based on, as I indicated, my caregiving journey. And then here are some of the resources that are available. The first one that I have listed is from the Consumer Voice. And Lee, can you explain about the Consumer Voice?
Yeah, the Consumer Voice is a really great resource for anybody who's navigating that long-term care path. It is a space where there's resources about long-term care. You can find information about the ombudsman. You can find information about adult protective services. You can find information about residents' rights. It's pretty all-inclusive for anybody who is navigating that path. It is a ombudsman-driven website. It's funded through through the federal funds, or I believe they get money through ACL to be able to do this. But I'm not really sure, to be perfectly honest with you, but it is a really great resource for anybody to be able to access.
And ACL is the abbreviations for the Administration for Community Living, which is part of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and that is part of our funding stream through the Older Americans Act. The next two links are to disability-related resources relating to voter rights. One of them has a focus for the ADA, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act. Again, I included the site to ACLU, and that was the advocacy organization that produced that voting rights card we saw several pages back. If you have more of a scholarly interest, the American Bar Association has a wide array of consumer education materials about voting. If you have problems, I included the resource that's been developed by Equip for Equality. Equip for Equality is the state protection and advocacy organization for the state of Illinois. And then my colleagues at Illinois Legal Aid Online have developed information about voting. And then one of the advocacy organizations for individuals with disability is called the ARC. And they have a voter guide. And I can't remember, I know I put the English version down. I can't remember whether it's also available in Spanish. But if you go to these organizations, even if it's not an advocacy organization listed online, there is a wealth of information out there. And I have come to the end of my conclusion, so I want to thank you for this opportunity to again collaborate and share legal information with the long-term care community.
Karen, thank you so much. I'll put it so that we don't, I'm just checking to see if there's any questions in the chat. Stephen, are you there? There you go.
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay.
We had one request if we could go back and show the screen giving dates for voter registration and early voting.
Okay, yep, we can do that. Let's see. I think we can do that.
It's gonna be at the beginning.
Yep,
Whoops, go back 3. Perfect.
here we go. And what we'll be doing is I'm going to take this PowerPoint slides and make sure that that gets posted onto the Illinois Ombudsman's website so that we have a Resident Family Support Council page there where we post our PowerPoints. So I'll be putting that there along with the resources that Karen has shared with us. That'll be a separate document as well.
And I believe I pulled this list off of the website for the Illinois State Board of Elections. If not, you can do a quick Google search and you can put deadlines, election in Illinois in 2024.
Great.
Now I had a question. So they do a signature verification at the voting site.
Mhm.
What if I've had a stroke and my signature is completely different than what it used to be?
Then that's when you may need to show some newer form of identification. So you can explain that you've had a stroke and you can see your newer form of identification, but it's also possible that you won't have that newer form of identification. In which case, if there is a question, that is a question relating to your eligibility as a voter. And you would want to indicate that you want a provisional ballot so that you can still vote while they determine after you leave your eligibility status.
Okay, I think
Yeah.
that's good to know for
And I would encourage anyone who is in that situation, you may also want to consider updating any of your signature requirements when you feel that you are able to go to your financial institution or to the election authorities and explain what's going on. The one thing I can say to everyone, because I've actually been part of the election process when I was a younger attorney starting out in my legal career, you know, most people want to be helpful. But it is hard to be helpful at the last minute when it becomes very time sensitive because there's so much other responsibilities going on. But that isn't to say not to ask for help, because getting help is your right. And as I indicated at the very beginning, no one person can always know everything because all of these processes are changing. When I started voting, when I first moved over to Springfield, I voted in what was called a senior high rise near my neighborhood. I've moved since then, so I don't know whether they still have voting, but it's my understanding that it used to be a lot of polling places were in long-term care facilities to make it easier for residents to be able to participate. And some of the residents with better stamina actually served as some of the poll workers during the day. And there's always a need for people to volunteer to help with the electoral process. But I'll be the first to admit, getting there before 6 a.m. and staying until 7 p.m., it's a long haul. So, and with the pandemic, there have been a number of changes. And I know during the pandemic, because there were so many concerns, a lot of people in long-term care facilities weren't able to exercise their right. And this is the first major election since the pandemic. So I hope that all the kinks have worked out and everyone will be successful in voting and have a satisfactory experience.
And I just, if you're an ombudsman and you are on this call, or even just another person who's a strong advocate, I really think that it's important that we ask the long-term communities that we go into, what is their plan? How are they ensuring that all their residents have that, their right to vote is being adhered to? So I want to encourage everybody to ask that question so that you can make sure. I do remember years ago, as a consultant, I was consulting to long-term care, and I got a phone call from an administrator on the day of the election day saying that our activity director forgot to do anything to make sure that everybody could vote. What should we do? And I said, you need to ask everybody in the building if they want to vote, and you got to get them to the polls, because they didn't do any of the pre-work that they needed to do, and voting, they couldn't do a mail-in ballot the day of. So it's really important not to wait till the last minute, because this is something that's really is important. Just to remind everybody that we all have that right to vote. It's a very important right as a citizen of the United States. And so I want to just make sure that everybody does understand that and talk to people, make sure they're enacting a plan.
Now, on the plus side, there is more resources available than ever before. There are more options to find out information using technology, so you don't have to go to the trouble of, making that personal visit to find out information, only to find out that you needed to have something with you that you didn't have once you made that first trip. So this is an opportunity after this election. You can reach out to local election authorities and see if they would want to send somebody to speak to your group about possible improvements. From time to time, your local elected representatives come to facilities and you can provide feedback. You may be part of some advocacy organizations, of which we've got the National Consumer Voice. So you can report back to ombudsman challenges, because the laws change in part to resolve issues. And I know that there are a number of older adults who take great pride in the fact that they've voted every election since they first became eligible to vote at age 18. I myself remember how excited I was in my family, who are pretty low-key people, I have to admit. But that was like a real rite of passage. And I still remember that, how proud I was that I had reached the point that I could exercise my right to vote. And it is a privilege. Not everyone in the world is able to do that. And for the vast majority of us, this is an important election. There are a lot of pressing policy issues that are interest to those of us who serve older adults and adults with disabilities.
And that was another question that I had for you. I really liked the sharing that you did with the policy issues that you put that will be statewide. I'm assuming those are statewide policies that will be on the ballot. Are there, or is there local initiatives that could also be happening, policy initiatives?
There could be, but I didn't look for that type of information. That's one of the reasons why you can, sometimes your local paper, if you still do the print copy, it used to be that they would print a sample ballot. Now you can go online based on your zip code and find sample ballots That's why I indicated there could be a wide variety of offices. And if you talk to someone who's in a different electoral district, and I've had people like get really hot about this issue. They're like, I didn't vote for that. And like, they're like, immediately start thinking something's wrong. And it's because you're in a different district. So you may have different offices because of different timelines.
Yeah, because what I appreciate about that is it got me to think, because some of those issues you brought up, I need to think about. And I find myself many times in the, the ballot booth, and I read it and I'm like, and I don't have a lot of time to really process it through. So I think that knowing those can be extremely helpful for all of us. Where would we go to find those statewide initiatives?
On one of the pages, I put down the link. It was called Ballotpedia. And that is a place that I was able to find a sample ballot.
Okay.
The other thing to know about voting is depending on the type of ballot, whether they give you a paper and a pen, whether it's like a voting machine, take your time reading it. Don't feel pressure just because there is maybe a line forming. This is your time and you take as long as you need. And if you think you've made a mistake, don't feel embarrassed. Don't rip up your ballot and go away, but go to the election judges and indicate that you've made a mistake and would like a new ballot. They will take care of how to report that so there's not a mismatch between the number of people who's come in and the number of ballots.
Well, this was all really, really great information. I really did appreciate it. I think knowing that the day of election is not necessarily going to be the day that we know who the winner is for the various elections throughout our state and country. Was also a great, healthy reminder for all of us that we might not know people that night,
Right.
Who won. A question did come up into the chat, I see. And that question was, if the person I want to vote for is not on the ballot, could I write in their name?
Yes, you can write in the name, but it needs to be a full name so that they can identify who you are intending to cast your vote for. And people write in when they're frustrated and they don't like the choices. I've seen people write in Mickey Mouse, Minnie Mouse. Well, I haven't seen because there's a right to privacy, but anecdotally, I've heard that people do that.
And, just because you bring up that right to privacy, if I live in a long-term care community, I might have this fear that if I did that, my mail-in ballot, how can I make sure that nobody takes that first of all, it gets taken care of, it gets mailed. Second, that they didn't change it. And third, that it stayed private, that no one else, because that's my privacy.
Well, first and foremost, if somebody is helping you, the law indicates that they have to respect your privacy. And there could be some form of civil or criminal charges, but I will that is not too likely to result. But if it is done at a facility, and I'm not casting any aspersions, but if there were a number of people who had the same problem at a facility, that might make it more likely to be investigated. And there are people out from the Attorney General's office doing poll watching, responding to complaints. There are representatives of political parties out and about. You have the volunteers at the elections, stepping in to minimize the problems, because everybody wants it to be a successful referendum without questions, because it's the questions that challenge the fundamental nature of our democracy.
Very, very, very well said, Karen. Karen, thank you so much for being part of this
You're most
today.
welcome. Thank
Really
you, Stephen.
appreciated this. Yes, Stephen, thank you. And thank you to everybody. And get out there and vote. Exercise that right as a United States citizen. We hope everyone heard that message loud and clear, and that your voting rights get adhered to. So with that being said, we'll go ahead we'll end the recording